Just a welcome to everybody, and here we are at our inclusion study group, and being facilitated by Ann Lovejoy, and we welcome you all. And go ahead, take it away there, Ann.
All right. Well, thanks, Karen and Reed, and welcome everybody. Thank you for showing up. I hope because we changed the time, I think some people may be signing in a little late, but that's okay. It's more like a community tea party that way. I'm wanting to talk a little more about the white supremacist culture document that we looked at earlier, because we had talked about looking at some of the antidotes, and we hadn't really done that very closely. And I feel like right now we are watching some of these some of these called out qualities of the white supremacist culture. We're watching them in action, and we are not seeing the antidotes. And I'm wondering a little bit about what you are all thinking as you watch this, especially maybe some of you students who might have voted for the first time. But even many of us who've lived through a lot of different kinds of social upheaval, this is really unprecedented wildness on the political and social scene. So I'm curious about, I sort of tagged a few of these things, and one of them was one right way, as that's the white culture's, there is one way to do this and this is how it is, versus the whole idea of there are many ways to be right, but also being willing to listen to other voices. And we're not really seeing that play out very much right now. So I'm curious if any of you have had observations or thoughts about that particular thing, or any of the other things on the list, really. I think the idea that one way, or it's sort of the my way or the highway idea, is very appealing in some ways because it's so simple, right? And black and white thinking is always simple, but it's also simplistic. And there's a huge tendency to reduce very complicated questions to simple sound bites, if you will, so that they can be argued out with a hammer instead of with thoughtful thoughtful understanding of some of the complications. I guess, I'd love to hear from some of the students if there's something, or Bonnie, do you have something there?
Well, maybe the students want to jump in first. I'll wait a minute.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
My microphone does not work. Okay, something that the first thing I thought of, and this is something that is a fault of mine, but I've never, I don't remember the book we were reading, but over the summer, the equity team was reading some chapters of a book, and they brought up Ebonics, and they brought up kind of how white people view Ebonics as kind of an inferior language, or kind of a language of like ghetto, or like a language that just like, I guess, correlates to you being less intelligent. And that is something I think that I've subconsciously done. And I think I've kind of seen that language as something that's improper, which I'm very ashamed of, but I think that that can kind of like relate to only one right way of like communicating, and like that white way of communicating. So that's the thing that I thought of.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting that before the time of radio, there were a huge number of regional accents and regional kind of sub-languages, as there are in many countries. But with the advent of radio and television, sort of like in England, there's the BBC correct pronunciation of things. We've become more homogenized that way too, and it does erase a lot of subcultures. And I think you're right. There's a definite, I have to admit that there are times when I hear somebody with a very heavy Southern accent and unconsciously assume that they're not particularly bright. So yeah, looking at those things in ourselves and saying, whoa.
Yeah, I had a wake up moment this week. NPR did a story on a rapper, and I want to say that he was a rapper in like Alabama. And based on the lyrics, his lyrics alone, he was charged, tried, and convicted of murder, even though he was innocent, just on the lyrics. Now, this was back in the 1980s and stuff, when rap, now they call it hip hop. In my day, it was rap. there was all of these sort of like gangster shootings, and I sat there and I thought, oh my God, I played into that too, thinking that rap was thuggish gangster language, and of course they're guilty immediately. You know, it was just something in the back of my head that I hadn't realized, that I was convicting and sentencing artists to something that they just weren't guilty of, just based on language, totally based on language.
Anyone else got anything to respond? You know, it makes me think that thug is actually a racial slur from India that refers to a group of people who were assumed to all be assassins and murderers, but actually weren't. But the English sort of picked it up and used it that way. And then we used that to kind of embrace a whole lot of different people in it with our assumptions too, right? So our language has to get picked apart as well as our assumptions and our ideas. Bonnie, were you going to call something out?
Well, when you mentioned, tell me what your very first point was. That will remind me. When you spoke
Well, I think
first,
I was talking about
one right way.
One way.
Okay. Okay. Well, in reading the papers, one of the things that jumped out at me was, in so many meetings and whatever, the objective is always to get through the agenda, and the point was taken that it takes time. Slow things down, hear what other people have to say, listen, I guess would be a big thing. And it isn't the number of things you can get through, which goes faster if there's one right way, because you don't have to hear objections and you don't have to. And then as you're talking about language, the people that are discredited because when they raise an objection, it becomes emotional. Then they turn that into it's rude. It's rude that you would say something against, my point. And I think it's pretty easy to be guilty of that, any of us.
Well, and that ties into one of the later points in this document, the right to comfort, that in white culture, one of the big pieces that people are using quite a bit is, well, I feel really guilty about that, so you're making me feel sad or bad by pointing out things that my culture has done to your culture, or that my family has done to your family, or that I have done to you. And that there was a movement for a while about calling out white tears as weapons, because, yeah, it's a way to silence other people, essentially, right? Doesn't even have to be about that. It was used in my own home family quite effectively. But I'm curious to hear from any of the teachers how in a classroom you handle this kind of, you're a teacher, right? So one way, right way, but I think that today we're using a lot of different tools to talk about how we're trying to encourage kids to think, not to memorize, right?
It's interesting. So I'll jump in here. And this is sort of, I guess, from a teacher perspective, I think a lot about what Gigi was saying, that my goal, like my purpose, is to help students understand code switching, essentially, and that we all do it. And when you, like, how you tailor your language to your audience in a way that makes your message most effective, right? Without being judgmental. And I think that's really hard, is how do you present, like, this is going to be effective, even though it may not be right? Like, I think that's hard, right? So we spend a lot of time, teaching students how to write respectful emails to their teachers. Well, when we're teaching them how to write respectful emails to their teachers, we're teaching them dominant white culture, like that's the way my grandmother taught me or something. So I feel like what I try to do is I try to observe when what we're doing has cultural connotations so that students are aware, and then they can make their own decisions, but trying really hard not to say this is better than that. Simply, how are you going to decide what to use? I think the thing that I wanted to mention that Bonnie brought up that I've been thinking about a lot is this notion of that sense of urgency. And when I'm trying to make decisions with groups right now, I'm thinking about reopening the schools and how those decisions are being made and whether all the voices are being included in that decision making. I'm thinking about my own desire to always reach what if we resolved? Let's write it down. Let's, make sure it's shared out. And so it's been really good to kind of observe where I fit into these and what my sort of stretches are going to be this year.
Yeah, that's a perfect example because it's so complicated, right? The greater good, the individual good, the safety of the kids and their families and grandparents, and the social needs that we all have, especially, I feel like in younger years, it's really important not to get isolated and lonely. And balancing all that mental and emotional health, the need to stretch all of us. These are amazing issues, really.
I was just going to say a word about that idea of sort of decision-making style or communication. I think that there's I definitely know I am guilty of the idea of forcefully arguing my point of view and expecting that that is a approach that is accepted as a commitment, as a, expression of my commitment or clarity about an idea, when it may actually be off-putting. It's mansplaining, certainly, in many cases, but it also is sort of a culturally approved way that we're going to, as Emily was saying, get to a decision in a certain period of time so we can move on, move forward. And although, I think it's kind of it's a difficult challenge because we have expectations, each of us, and we don't want to necessarily abandon the idea of trying to come to consensus or trying to come to some, date certain that we can say, okay, well, this is how we're going to move forward, at least for now. So it makes those negotiations difficult, and we just need to be, I guess, more transparent and open about what everybody around the table or the virtual table is trying to accomplish. And that means taking a lot more time at the beginning, which is the awareness that my way may not be the only way. It looks like Kristen has her hand up.
I do, yes. It's Kristen Toleson from the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art. And I think that you highlight something very interesting, Reed, about the culture and how many of us have come up in a culture that's been invisible to us, that culture of assertion or that culture of I'll just call it assertion, or linear culture or progress culture. And we get approval for that. We get it starting when we're in school, through school, into our, if you follow a, what I'll call conventional academic path that would be something that I know when I was a BHS student was really kind of the pathway that was opened up for me. You do well in school, then you go to a college, then you graduate, and there's this kind of, the culture is so steeped in our world that we've come to believe that that's what is right. And I think that it's so humbling to think about. On a very small scale right now, I'm on the advisory board for the career and technical education work through the district. And even just thinking about that as an alternative, it's such a small difference between academic path and other choices that might not be traditional academics. It's so fascinating to me that once you start peeling things back and realizing how assumptive we all have been, because we haven't seen it, or we haven't had to be challenged by it, it's very humbling.
I'm wondering from the students again, how you feel about you're in school in this time of enormous change, and we're sitting here saying you can't always believe everything you hear, see, write, you know. How does this feel to you? Because we're trying to step back as an older generation and say, wow, we need to listen more. But that puts you in a position of doing a lot of work to figure out what you really think, or how you view what you've been taught so far and how you view your own education going forward.
You know, something, and this is just from my point of view, I definitely have become, and I think this, like, our generation and a lot of people have just become more aware of just questioning the education system and questioning, like, why am I learning this today as opposed to this? Like, how will this help me in a few years after high school? Is this gonna, like, be beneficial to me, or is this like a waste of my time and energy? And I think, at least in the friend groups that I talk to and the people that I talk to, I just think that there is a lot of questioning. I think you guys are spot on. People are wondering, but do I want to go to college? Is that something that I actually want, or is that just an expectation that I feel pressure to meet? So I think that that's definitely interesting. And something else I just wanted to add on when we were talking about kind of our egos and how eager we are to just be comfortable in our own bubble of thought. I think, just speaking, we had obviously recently had a presidential election, and I think that it would very clearly, we saw how divided our country is. And I think that's like largely due to the fact that we are so uncomfortable hearing other people's opinions and so uncomfortable listening to other people because of the bubbles we're in and because of our like unwillingness to listen. And so I think that goes really on a huge scale for like the state of our country. So, yeah.
Sophie, do you have anything? I see you nodding.
Yeah, so adding on to what Gigi was saying, I've been thinking a lot about like how involved young people are in cultural change right now, and there's a lot of Gen Z activism happening. But I think that connects a bit to kind of an entire generation having a savior complex, and like since there's so many problems that we've inherited as we've grown up, that it feels like we're the only people that can possibly change them. So that's, I feel like, a consequence of adults or older generations like taking the foot off the wheel and leaving like momentum of change behind, because then all that pressure rests on us. And I think then in having like this young, potentially inexperienced generation with so many ideas trying to drive something, like we're not anywhere near the majority of the population, and we really need the teamwork of multiple generations working together and everyone being really involved in making things happen.
I definitely agree. I think a lot of teenagers have kind of a superiority complex. Me too sometimes. And I think we kind of think like, oh, like no one understands, like all the other generations put this on us. Like we are the ones that are going to solve it. We don't like need anyone else's help because no one understands. And I think that also has to do with ego. So yeah, that's a really interesting point.
I also feel like a lot of older, I'm sorry, Eleanor.
It's okay.
A lot of
Go ahead.
older people say, well, it's up to the kids now, and try to absolve ourselves of having to do the work ourselves.
Well, I was going to jump in and say, welcome to the 60s. And I say that not to be dismissive,
but that I think part of your instinct, which is absolutely correct, has to do with youth and vigor and an intention to make the world a better place. Well, we were there in the 60s, and you know what? We thought we made it. Well, maybe not all the way, but substantially. And, so it's really what I think everyone is saying. It takes all of us, and our attitudes or energies and focus may change over time, but we all have to come together to make a difference. Now, for me, part of the question is, well, how do you go ahead and make a difference? Which I think is some of the antidotes that were in the article. But forgive me for reminiscing for a minute, but back in the 70s, there used to be an architectural scholastic aptitude test like the LSAT and the MCAT. And one of the tests in it was you were given, it was visual, but it was also verbal. You were given two shapes, and you were asked to generate as many different images as you could from those two shapes. And then you could give them a name. So, there was a verbal component as well. Now, my only point in this is that I think this is one of the things, they stopped giving that test in the 70s. This is one of the things we've lost in education, is the techniques and approbation for generating alternatives. That, when you have a classroom full of 30 students, one way is what you do because you can't do 30 ways in an hour. So you do one way, and then if the students are really lucky, you find the people who aren't getting it and figure out how they can get it. But I think if we did more circumstances in education where students were asked to simply to generate alternatives, think of 3 different ways to do this, think of 4 different ways to do this, as opposed to the inevitable teaching to the test, which is going to ask you to do it one way. That's my rant.
Emily, do you want to, I feel like the pressure is really on teachers to do that pre-teaching to the test in Washington, at least, and in, I think, other states as well. But it sounds like you've made some huge efforts to not necessarily stop with that.
I think it helps that our standards, so the Common Core standards are skills-based, they're not content-based. And skills, you really can work into all of those different types of opportunities. So if I'm trying to teach students how to use evidence to support a point that they're making, they can do that in so many different formats, and they can do that with so many different topics. And so I feel like, this idea of differentiation, right? Not offering one way to do it and requiring everybody to do it, and then anyone who doesn't is like an outlier, but instead offering multiple pathways to kind of build those skills. That's something we've been trying really hard to do in education for the last 10 years. It doesn't mean we always manage, right? Because as we were saying, like when you have 30 students, it's hard to find the right fit for every one of them. But I think a lot of teachers are trying to offer, menus, or sometimes we'll say, here are the skills I want you to prove. How can you show this to me? So we're trying to offer more opportunities. It also depends on whether you're in an AP class. So those would be the ones Anne's talking about. So the high school AP classes are definitely teaching to a test. The rest of us have a little more freedom. But I'm curious, because this is my teacher, like what we aspire to do. What I don't know is how well that meshes with what you students are seeing in your everyday classes, right? It's one thing for us to intend to provide those differentiated opportunities. It's another for you to experience them.
Lena, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I think this is a very important and also interesting discussion about kind of how do we create these options and differentiate learning and allow students to kind of also mold and shape their own pathways and choose the best styles that work for them. And as I've gotten older, I've seen more and more different ways that teachers are trying to provide more options Like, for example, in my English class, instead of there just being like the one assignment for everybody, there's often like 4 or 5 different options to choose from. And I think that that's definitely a start, just giving people kind of more of a choice in how they learn, how, and just an opportunity to take control of their education. And then I also wanted to touch back. I know we were talking before about kind of how we all generations need to work together to find solutions to some of these, like, and to create kind of solutions to a lot of the white supremacy culture in our society. And I think aspect of that that's important too is right now it's hard because I feel like since it's new for, in my opinion, in my experience, for some older generations to be as willing to listen to young generations. I've often heard from people of older generations discredit like my thoughts or ideas just because I'm young. And it's kind of a hard balance too, because of course you want to respect your older generations, and but it's also hard because sometimes, like, I feel like that respect can also have a fact of like, I believe this, and since I have more like life experience, that I know more than you do. And it's also hard because in different situations, like different amounts of, I guess, freedom, or like there's different amounts of how much I feel like your ideas are listened to. So like you might go someplace and somebody will be like, oh, I hear what you're saying, and I'm listening to you. And then when you go someplace else, it's kind of like, no, my idea is the right way because I'm older. So I don't know. That's a long-winded way to say that, but I just feel like it's hard because it's not kind of the same openness to hearing other people's ideas everywhere. So
Sophie, would you feel like that you've had that experience as well?
Yeah, I think I haven't, obviously with COVID, been able to go out and talk to like a whole bunch of people, and I think within the bubble of Bainbridge Island there aren't that many people that I would like disagree fundamentally with. So I'm not sure like how many times I've necessarily been completely discredited because I'm young. But what Lena was talking about really reminded me of a couple of the points from the document, and like the way that politeness fits into fear of open conflict and the right to comfort. And like, how are we supposed to work together with generations if we feel like we have to be at a certain level of like either communication or a way of presenting an opinion in order for it to be taken seriously? So I think that like it doesn't just apply to people of color and white people, and it also transcends like age and generations.
I've always felt like a lot of that really was the root is the power hoarding, because demanding respect is implicit power over, right? And I think, yeah, I mean, having grown up with generations that felt very clearly that we as students in the 60s and 70s were crazy and out of line, I can really remember the frustration of that, but also saw the fear behind it, that when we bump into other people's resistance, a lot of times it is their fear of losing what they perceive as their power base, or life's experience equals a certain amount of power. Yeah, and I'm curious actually to see how different things may be now that the boomer generation of like me and Eleanor are moving up. We were kind of rebellious students all the way back down the line. So will we be more open-minded now? Will we be more open-eared now than our grandparents and parents? I don't know. I hope so.
I think that's a really good point with the age. I do want to, and I really respect what our students had to say about the age thing. And I've been seeing a counselor for ages and ages. And one of the things that has always a question in my mind is, when do I get to be the right age that I actually get to be taken seriously? I'm 50 years old now and I'm a grandmother. And did you know that I still get people telling me that I am, oh, you're young, you don't know, you just wait, you'll know. And so there's always that question of, when are you old enough to know, to have authority, you know, to have some autonomy.
Kristen, you had a comment.
Yes, I do. I'm sorry. I'm having a slow reception on here, so I'll just keep my camera off. But I do think what's interesting to me reading this again and looking at thinking about, as you framed it, and the climate right now and what's happening in politics. And I've wondered out loud to myself about the psychology of this. I did a little, I took a class in college on developmental psychology, and it talks about the development of the person as a child who is very self-oriented. They have their very kind of fundamental needs that need to be met. So they're kind of turned inward, and then gradually you imagine this kind of concentric circle widening around them as they develop into adult humans and become more aware of and more compassionate with the people who are farther away from their kind of fundamental needs. And I have a hard time not thinking about that when I look at politics right now. And also about when I look at the antidotes and the components of white supremacy, and how these things really require that we have a grounded sense of who we are, so that we can be grounded in exchanges with others. And I think that it's an interesting addition to the conversation about education, because in a way, many times we're encouraged not to develop that sense of who we are and to rely on an authority figure to give us meaning or approval for whatever it is that we're doing. And so that's just an observation. I think that so many of these things that come in the gray area between binaries or beyond binaries are things that, if we can sit with ourselves and not take it personally, that we have an opportunity to learn so much from.
One thing
I can't see that he was.
One thing that
Sorry,
really
go ahead.
struck me is what Sophie said about being able to get out of our bubble here. We all think alike, and talking to people that don't agree with us, and in being able to use these tools. That's been very difficult. I think even before the pandemic, it was difficult. I really don't know that many people that do not agree with me. And, and how do we make this a deliberate thing in order to leave and go to people that do not agree with us and have these conversations? And will they be willing to have these conversations with us? I
think that's a great point, Karen, because, we need a pop the bubble campaign, I think. But the fact that we feel like we have to go somewhere else to find people who might not agree with us also, I think, might not be quite so accurate. I think there are a lot of people who are hesitant to share opinions that they know are not very popular in our bubble. And after the election, when I was talking with a friend and saying, wow, 70 million people have a really different view of how things have been going with the current regime. And my friend said, well, yeah, so that means that each of us has to find someone to befriend and not just, try to argue with, but really listen to.
Mhm.
And, that's how and it's, look around. Maybe it's someone who works somewhere.
Oop. Yeah.
Casually, but not super well. But maybe if we foster those and say, I have a feeling that we probably have some differences, but I bet we've got some things in commonality too, it gives us a chance to actually make some bridges.
Right. Yeah, I'm really desperate to make those bridges. I look at half of the voting population and how they feel so completely different from the way I feel, and I'm like, I want to understand what got them to where they want to be and I want them to understand where I came from to become what I believe, and having those conversations are so important. And I wish we could get people that think differently to come into this group and talk with us. It would be really nice. That would be really, really wonderful to have a nice, uncomfortable conversation. So
maybe we need to have a pop the bubble conversation and reach out and say, we'd like to hear, we'd like to have a conversation. We don't want to rant at you, and we want to hear. And
right,
have to mean it.
Yeah, because I really think that's the only way to come together, to come to, to understand, to do our common goal of having a safe, inclusive environment. I mean, if that's in fact what some people want, inclusivity. Again, we were talking about the power hoarding, being afraid to lose the power. I know that that's a real thing. So
it definitely is. So Robin just shared on chat. Robin, do you want to speak up a little?
There we go. And can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
I have two things. I'm on a brand new Surface Go, so I'm experimenting. That's why it says my husband's name and not mine. A couple of things I put on chat, I guess. One is I'm 72, I'm retired, and I have grandkids and kids and gone through Bainbridge schools, and I actually have a number of young people who are friends that I seek out and talk to. And I, for one, would love you don't know who I am, but to know better ways. I haven't encountered problems from my end, but what things we could do to become more approachable. That's my number one point, because I really do not only value the youth input, but it's what I'm pinning my hope for the future on once I'm gone. And then the second thing I just wanted to add, if it's at all pertinent, because I noticed the topic was white supremacy. When back in 1991, a group of white supremacists came to the island. I know Emily, I'm sorry, Emily, I know you've got a different last name than Bailey, but I always forget. And she was a student, one of the teachers was a student. And they came to the island with the idea of eradicating the non-whites, because the non-whites were so small a portion of the population. And the mayor appointed me and Gina Corpus to spearhead a task force to figure out what to do about that. It was a very scary time. They were recruiting youth in the high school. There were lots of things going on, but that is and there's also right now there at the Bainbridge Island History Museum, there's a curious curator interview, as some of us are going through a scrapbook from that time, which actually brought me to tears when we're reviewing some of the hate literature that was spewed about. But anyway, I just thought I'd offer that background if anyone has any questions about almost 30 years ago or anything else. I'm also a retired appellate court judge, so I guess I'm used to listening to lots of different perspectives. But right now, I can't figure out how to make my screen show more people. Oh, I can see Lena Wood, but that's it. Hi, Lena. So I'll mute me, I think. Okay.
I'll just interrupt for a second and say to Robin that in the lower right-hand corner, there are 3 vertical dots. Right at the bottom, when you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen, it says raise hand, or that's where you also turned on and off your microphone. At the far right, there are 3 vertical dots, and if you click that, one of the choices that pops up is change layout. And if you pick tiled, then you'll see us all in gallery view like you would on. And I just, while I've got the, is the cure.
If I pick what do I have to pick?
In the layout, change layout, and then pick tiled.
Oh, change the, oh, okay. Thank you. I am just now learning how to do this. Okay. This is my very first attempt with this thing. Thank you.
And the Google has changed this platform every week. So we can now raise hands, which is something we couldn't do the last time we met. And the Curious Curator is the one that you're talking about, community diversity. Do you know?
I don't think so. I'd have to look it up on
I'll
my
just
phone.
put a link to the whole.
It's an interview with me going through with Katie.
Bainbridge Island protest.
No, it was
Curious Curator.
What?
It is the Curious Curator.
Yeah, but there are several Curious Curators. I can forward.
So I'll just put a link to the whole curator section there.
I can send you, Reed, a link to the specific one.
And I can share it with everybody.
Yeah. I just don't know the name of it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. No problem. There we go. I'll do that right now. Okay. Done.
Thanks, Robin. So, Katie, you've been very quiet.
Yes. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone who's been speaking. I've learned so much in this just short amount of time. Even though I've read this article 3 times, I learned something new. What struck me interesting is the notion that we're all speaking in a bubble, and I agree with a lot of that. I really think just like talking to anybody, there's got to be a high degree of trust, and just asking people to come into an organizational forum like this, I don't think is probably the way that I would recommend. It's a really long game. And so just like when I first got here, I could feel the bubble, and I could feel myself going in and out of the bubble in terms of my own acceptance. And because I'm not from wealth. And so when I joined organizations to make my personal impact, I decided to cross the bridge. And so I volunteered. I'm an ex-teacher, and I volunteered in the Suquamish school. And then I looked at the composition of the Bainbridge Island Rotary Club, and I looked at the composition of the Paulsbo Rotary Club. And so I could tell that the Paulsbo Rotary Club had a lot more blue collar workers. And so that's where we joined. And so I would say that club is about split evenly, maybe even more towards being far more conservative than I am. But they are the ones who taught me how really make concrete for me what it means to love people that don't think like you at all. Because at some point when you're working on projects to serve other people, you find common humanity. And so, and the long game here on Bainbridge Island is that as long as we don't have more diversity in the opportunities of people who can live here, really half the island every day is populated by people who don't live here. They're coming across from, Belfair and from all over to meet the the needs of the community here, which is, you know, basically domestic help and gardening. And, you know, my parents were gardeners. So it's really more than having an invite to come and have a conversation about, you know, what makes you so different. It's just, I think it takes far more effort. And you really have to, how would you want to be treated if you were in a place that you didn't feel comfortable? I mean, I think that's what truly is behind the word inclusion. It's not being a member of the senior, the community center. It is having your thoughts valued and having the life that you bring, which is so different than the people here, valued and understood. And it's only understood when you make personal connections. And that, like I said, is a long game. And it's also one where you not only put more than your intellectual, but your emotional heart to that relationship. So that's all I have to say.
Don, I bet you could speak to this somewhat too.
I'm still kind of exploring what you all are doing, and haven't read any of the specific material. But of course, I'm still very conscious about the fact that I'm a white male. On the other hand, I'm also conscious of the fact that I've reached the grand old age of 84. And that gives me a little different perspective than some of you who are quite a number of years younger. Let me just illustrate with something I decided to do this morning as the first time in my life ever. I became aware that this is Trans Day of Remembrance, and unfortunately, because of the epidemic, we didn't get to celebrate that, not celebrate, but honor that in the past, as we did in the past couple of years at the Bainbridge Art Museum with the Remembrance Service. That so moved me for the times that I was able to do that, the 2 times. Last year, we read the names of 125 trans people from all over the world who had died in various ways. And just right on target this morning, I happened to get a list of trans people who died in just the United States from the ACLU. They put this list together, and they gave us a lot more information about how and why people died. So I decided to take a risk for me, which was to send that information out to all members of my family, my chosen family, as well as my given family. And I'm going to be very interested in hearing people's response to that. I've sort of assumed the role of the family elder, because I am indeed the family elder. So it's going to be very interesting to see what comes of just that, taking that one risk for me in that way. It's not, it doesn't really target what you all are talking about, but it may serve in a way to introduce me a little more.
I think it does target what we're talking about, Don, because part of it is stretching. And as you know, the mother of a transgender person, I feel like every time I am willing to talk openly about that relationship and about that instance in my own experience, I help normalize something that has been, I mean, I have ever had, but transgender people, not so much. The transgender community is much more at risk. And to me, when we look at white supremacist culture, we're looking at a history of rejection for almost everybody who is not, doesn't fit a pretty narrow category. I remember talking to some families from Bangor who, when their kids came out as transgender, they said, oh yeah, the military life is great and you can always count on tons of support unless you're different. And then the support evaporates, even in that tight community. I see, Robin, you're smiling. So I think, we have so many wounds in our culture that we haven't really looked to get. And maybe we're getting to the level of maturity that we're going to be able to do that together. I sure hope so. And I think you're totally right on, Kimmy, too, that it is a long game. but it's got to start with something. And opening ourselves, it fits into so many of these things. One right way, paternalism, power hoarding, fear of conflict, making nice, all those things keep us from really listening, or being open to truly listening. So we're all stretching out here and learning, but helping each other do that, I think, is a great step along the path. And I hope for you students that you can come to us and talk freely about what you think and say, and not get rebuffed because we're older than you. I sure hope you would call us out if you feel that coming from anyone here, for sure.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of when Robin was talking about how the boomer generation can be more approachable to youth. I think that honestly, like this group in particular, by having these conversations, you aren't the people that are, I don't know, shutting us out. Like you guys aren't the target audience for like, wow, we really need to deal with those boomers. And I think that to what Kimmy was saying, like inclusion, it doesn't have to happen in formal settings. Like that doesn't have to be where it starts. I think it can be a lot more powerful in informal settings, like out and about in public places, even though that doesn't really happen as much now. But like in casual conversation, making it more normalized to call someone out or explore their opinion. And I think if in the event that we, I don't know, invited people that we know disagree with us, that would probably feel like a pretty scary experience for someone to feel really alienated. And I think by being in a more comfortable setting and just everyday life, like I said, that's going to have more of a lasting impact.
Yeah, I was going to make something of the same point, but first of all, I have to call Anne out. I am not a boomer. I'm a war baby. I have to defend my own generation. It does make a slight difference in terms of when one came to awareness and I mean, I had to be converted to right thinking, as it were. But it's the idea that our everyday contacts with people matter a whole lot, whether it's, a person you pass on the street, whether it's someone walking down your street who looks different, whether it's a clerk in a store. To make a real connection, not just to take them for granted, but to acknowledge them as real human beings, is the beginning of being open to, what Margaret Mead said years ago, look until you see, listen until you hear. So it's not a question of hearing, it's a question of listening, it's a question of hearing. We want to really hear. We want to hear what people really have to say, not just, what they think is acceptable or what may be expected in the moment.
I agree. I really just couldn't agree more than with what Kimmy said. I came from a family of 9 and my parents were janitors. So, and the last 2 towns I've lived in, Saratoga, California, and Bainbridge Island now, is that the people that we come in contact with every day in our stores and our baristas or, are what they consider blue collar workers, they don't live here. And that's a problem to me. I remember the town I lived in, it was on the other side of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And when there was very seldom, there was snow up in the mountains. And when it snowed, the schools had to close down, not because there was snow at the school, it's because the teachers couldn't get to the school. And in that, it is a long thing to deal with. I mean, it's a long range, but why can't we work in the live in the communities that we work? And I don't care how much you make. Maybe that is a real problem, and I think we do lose connections with people of different economic backgrounds because of, we end up all in this different bubbles. And I think that it's such an important concept. And Dawn, I just really love that what you said about what you stepped out of your comfort zone and shared with your family and doing that. And I take that as something I want to do more too. So thank you for that.
I guess going forward, I would really like everybody to think about something to share for next time of like, what does inclusion actually look like in action? Because I feel like that's something we're all hoping for, is to get past. I mean, conversations are awesome because it really helps us stretch and think, but then it's what we do, and how do we really effectively reach out or be accessible? Yeah. We talk, one of the white supremacist things is about metrics and how you measure, is this effective? Did we get a lot of our points made? Are we progressing in growth terms? And, what if we're really in the process of changing a lot of those metrics and saying, did we hear each other? Were all the voices come to the table? Did everybody speak what they needed to? And then were they heard? Maybe that's going to be how we start conducting our meetings. I'm thinking about this because we had a board meeting in the community I live in, of 50 homes, and a very, very difficult topic came up. And I'm usually pretty good about getting through the agenda and making sure we get off in time, but we had to stop and say, this is going to take more time, and we're going to meet again next week. And we need to really respectfully hear each other, because this is a very heavy duty, serious, complicated issue. And I was really pleased that I didn't get any pushback, which I usually do. If it's 2 minutes over, everyone's like, time to go home. But I think respecting each other's differences is starting to be a more shared value, and I'm really grateful for that.
Mm-hmm.
I hope also that you'll all look at, in the chat, people are sharing some great links to resources, and Kristen just put out a resource for generating thoughts on ways to be more inclusive. So maybe we can take a look at that for next time too, because I think this is, we're exploring new territory, but we're not alone. So reaching out for these resources and then practicing with each other. Bonnie, did you want to say something?
Well, yes. My first observation, and I think I made it before, but for the young students, for the students who happen to be young, I'm so impressed with your being able to be so articulate, and for your deep thinking, and for your desire to take time to come to this meeting, and it's just impressive. And this is an aside, but it was very easy for me to generalize all during this election process of who were these people that voted for Donald Trump? Who were these people? Well, it was just mind-boggling. But one interview I saw with two people that I actually understood. One was a woman whose son was in the military, and through these 4 years, he hadn't gone to war. I could understand why she would think that was, why she could follow him, thinking about her son. The other one was a Hispanic woman who, when she was young, had been shot. She had children. She had nothing. Well, she actually started working in the janitorial area, and then she started her own little business. And she's very proud of it, and as she should be. And she said, if through Obamacare she had to pay for the insurance for her workers, she would make no profit. The profit margin was about 10%. Well, actually, I understood that too. So I thought there were two people I could understand. The other 70 million, I'm not sure. But I think that, you know, we're at this huge crossroad, and sometimes it's just overwhelming to think about what in the heck are we going to do. Even when we get through the transition, what are we going to do that we're so divided? It's frightening.
Well, I agree with you, Bonnie. I personally am heartsick at the division in our culture, but I also feel like there's a huge value in knowing that it exists and recognizing it. And that for most of the people, I think on whatever side of whatever fence we pick, I think ignoring the divide is easier than trying to work together to really to build communities that are not built against anything, but are actually for each other, for connections. That's hasn't been the way our country has worked. And it isn't the way very many countries work, I don't think. But I feel like it's the work of not just the future, but the present. So, yeah, like Kimmy says, long game, got to start, and every single generation between has to join in. Eleanor?
Yeah, I think too that part of the problem is we're given an either or choice. You know, either you're for us or you're against us. You know, when in fact I'm thinking about, you know, the people who they talked about a single issue or a single thing that, you know, they felt was being done right in this administration. You know, it's obviously more complicated than that, but we go ultimately to the thing that matters most to us. If we could get together and have the conversations, we might in fact be able to see that the difference is not in the goal or the objective, but in the means of getting there. And you know, the difference between a means that excludes a lot of people and a means that includes everyone. Just quickly, another resource, and I'll see if I can hunt up the connections to it. I listened last night to a lecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design about the city as commons, and the idea of collective governance of common spaces in the city. That is, a public park belongs to the public. A vacant lot that's owned by the city actually belongs to the community. And I started thinking, could this idea be used as a way to make a community more inclusive, as opposed to drawing on the inclusiveness of what's already there? And I think that's worth considering for a place like Bainbridge, which, you know, yeah, it's not as literally inclusive on the ground as we would like it to be.
We're running over our time here, but anybody got anything they want to say before we?
I just have one more thing. Being kind of a numbers wonk, this last election compared to the election before that in 2016, the divisions of votes is really not that much different than it had been for decades. We have actually been very divided for a long time. A lot of our elections, presidential elections, are won by just by 1 or 2%. I mean, it's been that way for a long time. And So this election is not really that different, except that it's being contested, and who knows how long that's going to last. But I think that what we are more is that we're more aware of our differences and that we're trying to work it out now, where we weren't before. So that's just a little add-on I had there. But I think we've been divided for a lot longer than we think.
Probably from the foundations of the colonialist culture.
Exactly. So,
I always think about how America was taken over by people who were either left the culture they came from because they were stiff-necked and didn't refuse to obey certain rules because they were too rigidly religious, because they didn't, there were a whole lot of reasons, but a lot of the reasons were actually fairly negative.
Mm-hmm.
And our culture reflects some of that rigidity of thought.
Exactly.
And I think we've got deep roots, but so do many countries. And it's not just America. We are making everything really blazingly obvious for the whole planet to watch, but the problems exist in pretty much every culture. And the task is to move forward to bump the human race forward a little bit. But I got to say, when I get really discouraged, I think about how in the timeline of human history, progressive thought is really pretty recent, like a few hundred years. And yet we've made more progress than we might always feel like we have. There's a wonderful book called Factfulness. I don't know if any of you have read it, by one of the people who started the World Health Organization. And it really talks about how the world is in much better shape than we think it is, and that a lot of our ideas about how things are going worldwide are really out of date. And the author uses the example of his own family, where his grandmother lived in Sweden in a dirt floor farm. And, his parents got electricity and water and eventually had a washing machine, right? And it's like, so he can train 3 differences between that and being a doctor who is recognized expert around the world. So I think it is really easy to be horrified and depressed. God knows it happens to me too. But I think we really do need to think about the progress that has been made as well, and how reasonable and totally acceptable it is that there be a lot of pushback to what has been an accepted culture for millennia, power over, right? We're just trying to do something different that's really big. So onward.
Yep, onward. So, well, should we close it up, Ann?
Yep. Thanks everybody so much for coming. Thanks, Lena, for hanging in, and all of you for participating. See you next time.